All right, let's jump right in. At the very core of Christianity, there's this one single, absolutely astonishing claim. A claim that kicked off a global movement. But have you ever stopped to wonder, where did this belief actually come from? So today, we're going to put on our detective hats. We're not theologians here, we're historical investigators, trying to solve a genuine puzzle about a world-changing idea.
And this really is the big one. I mean, for historians, this is a huge question. Think about it. You've got this small group of followers. Their leader was a crucified messianic claimant from, a pretty remote corner of the Roman Empire. And then suddenly they just explode onto the world stage with this incredible energy. So what happened? What could possibly cause that? And why did this movement end up looking the way it did?
Well, the early Christians had their own answer, and it was a shocker. They said their leader, Jesus, had been bodily raised from the dead. Now, let's be super clear. Our goal here isn't to argue for or against that claim. Our job is to keep our historian hats on tight and just try to understand what that idea even meant back then. I mean, what would a regular person in the first century, whether they were pagan or Jewish, what would they have thought when they heard this?
Okay, so before we can solve the puzzle, we kind of have to know the current lay of the land, right? There's a pretty dominant view in a lot of modern scholarship, and it's the one our source material is really pushing back on. It basically suggests that this whole idea of a physical resurrection, well, that wasn't the original belief. The argument is that the word resurrection was, a bit fuzzy at first. Maybe it just meant Jesus was exalted to God's right hand in a spiritual kind of way. And then, according to this model, all the more concrete stories, the empty tomb, the physical appearances, those were developed and added to the stories way later. So that's the intellectual backdrop for our investigation.
All right, so if we're going to figure out where this idea came from, our first stop has to be the wider Greco-Roman world. Was this a common idea back then? Was it just something floating around in the cultural air that the first Christians could have, just picked up and used?
And wow, this quote just hits you, doesn't it? This is Achilles, the greatest hero of the Greeks, and he's speaking from the underworld. He's basically saying he'd rather be a slave on earth than the king of the dead. For him, and for the entire world shaped by Homer's stories, death was a one-way street. There was no coming back, and whatever existence you had afterwards, it was just a gloomy, miserable shadow of what life used to be.
So the pagan world really had two main ways of looking at it. On the one hand, you had Homer's bleak picture of being a witless ghost down in Hades. Or you had the more philosophical take from Plato, where your mortal soul is finally set free from the prison of your body. But here's the key thing, the one thing they both agreed on. The body is gone for good. Nobody was expecting it to come back, and honestly, nobody even wanted it to. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, what about all those stories of dying and rising gods or heroes who come back from the underworld? People point to those all the time. But the thing is, when you actually look at them closely, none of them are really talking about bodily resurrection. The myths about gods like Osiris, they were metaphors for the seasons, for the agricultural cycle. Those stories about someone coming back to life in a novel, it was always just a plot device, like they weren't really dead, just in a coma. It was resuscitation, not resurrection. A hero's soul might become a star, sure, but the body was always left behind. So the bottom line is, this idea of a specific person's body coming back to a new, permanent, transformed physical life, it just wasn't on the pagan map at all.
Okay, so if the idea of bodily resurrection wasn't just floating around in the Greco-Roman world, where else do we look? Well, the next logical stop for our investigation has to be within Judaism itself. Could this belief have roots in Israel's own scriptures and traditions?
In the earliest Israelite beliefs, the focus was almost 100% on this life, right here, right now. A blessed life meant living a long time, having lots of kids, and holding on to the land God had promised. The afterlife? It was a place called Sheol, and it sounded a lot like the Greek Hades, just a shadowy, silent place for ghosts. Hope wasn't really about what happened to you after you died, it was about the future of the nation as a whole.
And you can actually trace how this hope evolved over centuries. For a very long time, the afterlife was just Sheol. That's it. Then you start to see the prophets, like Ezekiel, and that incredible vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, using resurrection as this powerful metaphor for the whole nation of Israel coming back to life after exile. But the real game changer, the real turning point, happened during a time of horrific persecution, the Maccabean crisis. Suddenly, people were being killed, martyred for their faith. And this created this huge theological problem, a crisis of justice. That's what led to a brand new hope, spelled out clearly for the first time in the book of Daniel, that God would ultimately make things right by raising the bodies of the righteous from the dust.
And that brings us right up to the 1st century, the world of Jesus. Now, by this point, that hope that started back in Daniel's day had definitely developed, but it wasn't the only game in town, not by a long shot. The landscape of what people believed was actually incredibly diverse.
So if you were a Jew living back then, you had a whole menu of options for what you could believe about the afterlife. You had the Pharisees, who were a huge influence, and they were all in on a future bodily resurrection. But then you had the Sadducees, the temple elite, and they said, nope, no afterlife at all. Then you had other groups, like the Essenes or Jews who were more influenced by Greek philosophy, and they believed in an immortal soul that just floats away from the body, kind of like Plato's idea. The main takeaway here is that resurrection was a hot topic, something people argued about. It wasn't some universally accepted, settled belief.
And this part is absolutely crucial. We have to understand what the people who did believe in resurrection actually meant by that word. For them, it wasn't just coming back to life. It was a two-step process. Step 1, you die, and you exist in some kind of in-between state. Step 2, way down the line, at the very end of time, God is going to do this massive act of new creation and give everyone a new, improved physical body. It was a future event, a cosmic event, and it was for everybody, all of God's people at once.
And right here, this is where we get to the absolute heart of our historical puzzle. So, let's recap. We've seen that resurrection wasn't a pagan idea. We've seen it was a very specific, future-oriented hope held by some Jews. So, now let's see what the very first Christians did with that hope. This is where the radical mutation happens. Just look at the difference. The standard Jewish hope was for a general resurrection, for all the righteous, happening at the end of time. But the Christian claim, it was that the resurrection had happened to one single person, the Messiah, and it happened right in the middle of history. This just completely blew up the timeline. It split history right in two, and believe me, this was not what any Jew was expecting.
So let's put it all together. The early Christian belief didn't come from the pagan world. We've seen that. And it wasn't just a simple copy and paste of what Jews already believed. It was this shocking, completely unprecedented redefinition of that Jewish hope. They took an event that was supposed to be for everyone at the end of time, and they said, nope, it happened to one guy right now. And that is what creates such a fascinating and unique historical problem.
So we've pretty much established that this belief was a historical one-off. It had no real precedent in the pagan world, and it was a massive, shocking twist on Jewish expectations. So that leaves us with the ultimate historical question, the real puzzle we've been working towards. What is the best explanation for why? Why did a group of first-century Jews suddenly and radically change one of their core beliefs in this specific way? A change that would, quite literally, go on to change the world. What kind of event could possibly explain the origin of such a completely unprecedented idea?